Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Hello, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Tabak, and today we're going to discuss the relationship between the United States and China. What should we know about China? My guests today are, my guests are Andy Anderson from the University of Northern Iowa, Ling Zhang at Cornell College, and David Nordmann at Coe College. And I'm going to ask each of them to say a little bit about themselves. Andy I met at the University of Northern Iowa's Jepson Symposium in each of the last 2 years. He shared a dinner table with me, was very kind to my students, and then he gave a marvelous talk last year about the Chinese economy and the business relationships between the United States and China. So tell us a little bit about how your interest in China developed and what you're going to bring to our conversation today.
So thank you for the kind introduction. I actually first went to China by pure chance. So I'm from Boone, Iowa, and studied at Northern Iowa for my undergraduate degree in supply chain management. At the end of my degree, my advisor at the time encouraged me to take an internship in China in the international logistics department of a large Chinese state-owned enterprise. And I didn't speak a word of Chinese, and I had never been to China, didn't know anyone on the entire continent, but decided to take the leap. And after that, I just got sucked into China. It's a fantastic culture, fantastic, interesting language, food, everything. So just went back to the US and worked in the corporate world for a while, and then quit my job and moved back to China to study Chinese full-time at China, Northeast University of Finance and Economics in Dalian, China. So that was really where my love affair started.
Okay, and married a Chinese woman?
I married a Chinese woman, that's right, yeah, who I met in England, actually, in graduate school.
And developed some business interests in China that
that's
you
right,
might share
that's
with
right.
us too.
Yeah,
okay.
So I started a company called Trans-China Solutions back in 2007, and we do new product development and supply chain management, mainly for clients in the US. Since I've taken the position at UNI, I've sort of stepped back from that to a certain degree, and my wife does the majority of the work, but I still do a lot of the modeling side of things, the mathematical modeling side of the value chain mapping and these sort of things, as well as the strategy side. So we travel back and forth to China on a very regular basis.
Ling Zhang is a colleague of mine at Cornell College and recruits international students for us. So tell us a little bit about your background, how you happened to come to Cornell, and what kind of work you're doing now.
Sure, thank you. I am actually originally from China. I studied in China for over 20 whatever years, so I was born there and raised there. And I came to America for my graduate degree. So I got my master's in America and my doctorate degree in education in South Dakota, actually. So I've been living in the Midwest for over 10 years, and just kind of fall in love with Cornell College and moved here, and been working at the Cornell College for over a year, doing international recruitment and admission.
And so international recruitment means that you go to China as well.
Correct, yes.
And you're meeting with Chinese students and
yes.
Making an effort to persuade them to come and study here.
Correct. Visit high schools and colleges and organizations in China. I pretty much go to China twice a year. And
then I think from our conversation, you're extending yourself personally too to help some of these Chinese students and other international students accommodate and settle here in the United States, adapt to life in the United States.
Correct, because like I said, I was originally from China, so I was an international student myself. So I understand the frustration and concerns that they have, or the difficulties that they are going to encounter when they first get here. And also I'm the faculty advisor for our Chinese Student Association at Cornell College. So.
All right. Now, David, you're teaching Asian history, is that right?
That's right.
You're a member of the history department,
right.
Is that right? And your principal interests, as I understand it, are Japan and Korea, but you've also had some experience and study in China. So talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, well, if like you're right. I mean, actually, so I got into the field back in the I'd say early 1990s when a lot of the issues we're talking about today were about Japan, and of course, many of the predictions about what was going to happen regarding Japan didn't happen, right? So, but back in in those days, Japan was really hot, and so I was a Japan specialist, and I also developed Korea as a subspecialty as well. But you can't escape China if you're in the East Asia field. So, when I was in graduate school, I had to pass PhD exams in Chinese history. And even though I primarily go to Japan and Korea, I have been to China a few times. In fact, just a few months ago I was there. So
I'd like to say just a few words about myself as well. At Cornell College, I am the faculty director of what we call the McQuethy Program for Economics, Business, and Public Policy. So I'm involved in, I teach computer science full-time, but I have this second role where I engage students in questions like those that we are discussing now. Now, David, you mentioned the worries in this country about Japan. Are you thinking as the 1980s, 30 years ago,
sure,
that time frame?
Yeah.
And people worried that more directed, more planned economy was going to overtake the United States? Is that what that's
well,
about?
sure, yeah. I mean, there was a very famous book that came out about Japan
Right.
in 1979 called Japan is Number One
Right.
by Ezra Vogel at Harvard
Right.
University. And the prediction was by the year 2000, Japan would have long since surpassed the United States in economic terms. And there was books coming out that every American was going to be working for a Japanese and that the Japanese were going to take over the American economy. The Japanese controlled so much U.S. debt. And the Japanese were a threat. The trade deficit was a huge problem, and so all of these fears of Japan, or some of these things that you hear about China today, people were saying about Japan back then, and very few of them, if any, have come to pass. Right?
So I was moved to propose this discussion to our producer because my perception is there is more conversation this year, not only in the United States, but in Europe and elsewhere about immigration, about trade, about free and fair trade. A lot of anxiety, growing anxiety, not just in our own country. And I worry that we're not learning as much as we could from the experience of other people and from our own history. Do you see some of these patterns too? Can you comment on that? Are we learning what we should from models of history or models of other countries?
Sure, that's an interesting question actually, because the U.S. and China are in no way military allies, and that's quite different from the Japanese experience.
Right.
So we have two very, very different environments here. There are certainly stark similarities between the rise of Japan and the rise of China, but there are very important differences as well. I don't know if do you care to comment on some of the differences that you've seen in your work?
Well, I mean, you're right about that, certainly, in terms of military rivalry, which, that's another topic. But yeah, the United States, of course, has permanent troop presence in Japan that's been there since 1945. And there has been talk, certainly with the Obama administration, of doing this pivot to Asia, in which the United States was going to be more assertive in the region to try and stem the rise of China. And of course, right now, there's a lot of talk about the South China Sea and the rising naval rivalry there. So in that sense, yeah, in a political sense, I think, yeah, Japan and China relationships with the United States are quite different. But I was speaking mostly in terms of economics, which I think there's a lot of similarities. And more, what I was getting at was I think that a lot of the fears of China economically are exaggerated, just like a lot of the fears regarding Japan in the 1980s and 1990s were exaggerated and haven't really played out. And I think just a lot of these issues in general about trade deficits being such a big problem are much older even than the 1980s and 1990s. That it's a perpetual aspect of economic relations between the U.S. and Japan or China. That there's almost always a trade deficit. It's as normal, almost as normal as anything.
So Ling, tell us a little bit about what these Chinese students are looking for when they come to the United States, what the attractions are for an American education. I think many of our neighbors, to the extent that they have interaction with Chinese people, it may well be through Chinese students at our colleges and universities here in Iowa.
Sure. I think the Chinese student, they're looking for a good education. And of course, you know, America has the well-known world top world education and research. And also, I think for a lot of Chinese students, they're not just here to get education and stay here. A lot of them actually are looking at getting a really good education in America, then go back and find a really good job. And also, I have a contact who worked as a Minister of Education in China, and she, I talk with her pretty frequently for, you know, admission and a recruitment purpose. And she just told me, she said the Minister of Education, which means, you know, the big department that oversees all the education-related issues, has just announced that they are encouraging all the students in China to kind of do this international studies. Not just, you know, like not only for the student who want to come and do a full-time, full degree seeking program, but also they encourage the Chinese student to do exchange. Go to America, go to Europe, do, you know, 1 semester, 1 year. That's why I think we see a lot of colleges in America doing this 2+2 or, you know, 3+1 kind of exchange program. Does that kind of make sense?
Sure. So I'd like to ask you now about
Sure.
what surprises those who come to our country, and then what you think Americans might be missing when they visit China. So many Americans are now traveling to China and getting some picture of the country, but they might be missing some important pieces.
Yes.
And to get you started here, I want to tell you a little story, and then you can respond to this.
Yeah.
Well, I studied computer science. I was in graduate school. A large fraction of my classmates were international, and many of them from China. And near the end of my graduate studies, I had a friend who called himself Gary. Now, I never inquired very much about where he was born. I knew about I could tell what his ancestry was, but I didn't know where his birthplace was. And he called me aside. We were at the end of the week, Friday afternoon, just kind of shooting the breeze when the work of the week was done, you know, 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. And he asked me, Leon, he said, why are our classmates borrowing money to go to graduate school? Now, we all had teaching assistantships, so even the least well-supported of us had a stipend that was sufficient to pay the rent, and our tuition was waived and so on. You could live a modest lifestyle. Well, some of the American students didn't think that was enough. They were borrowing so they could live a little bit higher. And Gary had come here, and the first year he lived in an apartment he shared with 5 other students, and they had a grocery budget of $50 a month or something. It was rice and cabbage. The second year, he bought a used Honda Civic. He repaired it in the street himself. He bought a manual and fixed it. The third year, he traveled around the United States to visit the national parks. He sent half of his stipend home and helped his parents retire. And he's showing me his statements from Fidelity Investment and all the mutual funds he has. And he said, why are Americans, he had a completely different perspective of the world. So that's my story. What are your stories about this contrast of expectations? Chinese coming to the United States, Americans going to China. And we'll let each of the others as well comment.
Sure. I will start if you guys don't mind. I think that's changing because in the past, I would say 20, 30 years ago, the student you've seen, the Chinese student who are studying in America, they are here to do a graduate program, and most of them are a graduate assistantship. Actually, let's say back then, 20 years ago, if they don't have a graduate assistantship, it's going to be hard for them to get a visa. But now you're going to see the trend of the student from China who are coming to American high school or even middle school, and some are looking at, you know, elementary school even. So, you know, like I said, it's very different because credit card it has never existed probably 15 years ago in China. But now I think the Chinese people are kind of getting used to the concept of credit card and borrowing the money. When I was grown up, I mean, that's the philosophy we have. If you don't have the money, don't spend it. You always have to have some kind of saving. But, you know, with this new generation, it's not like that anymore. They want to borrow money. They want to use the credit card. And a lot of times, since, you know, China has been doing the one-child policy for a long time, so a lot of the families nowadays, if you look at the student who are attending college, they're the one child, in their family, and the parents doing the saving, and the grandparents also help out. So they use all this money to sponsor the student to receive a good education.
So my friend Gary borrowed money from an American professor he met in China, got to the United States without a penny left in his pocket, had to call the dean to get a ride from the airport to the university. That's how he started. When he left, he had more than any of us, right? Okay, so you go from Boone, Iowa to China. Tell us about some of the surprises, the contrasts that you experienced.
Yeah, so again, I lived in Dalian in northeastern China, it's on the peninsula, right in between Beijing and North Korea on a peninsula surrounded by sea on 3 sides. And I was one of the only foreigners in the city that I lived in. I lived in a northern suburb of the city called Kaifachu, so the free trade area. And back then it was a very stark difference. This was back in 2005. And I, as an American who had just recently graduated from undergrad, was actually considered fairly well off compared to a lot of my coworkers who had been in industry for 10, 15 years. So speaking to this change that's happened with the students, your experience is very different from what we see from students today at the University of Iowa, Iowa State, UNI,
sure.
All across
Cornell
the board.
College
Cornell
as well.
College as well. It's very different. So China everybody used to be poor. Right? And now, not everybody's poor. It's still a very poor country. I think that's one of the misconceptions for Americans. They think of China, they think about this very, very strong, wealthy country, right, where everybody's rich, but that's not always true. There are very rich people in China, but there are even more poor people still today. So the rich ones get to come over to China, the U.S. in some cases, and the poor ones we don't see quite as much unless they're on these graduate fellowships.
Exactly.
Necessarily.
Yeah.
What are some of the misconceptions you'd like to correct here?
Well, I don't know about misconceptions, but I mean, I'd actually just sort of echo that. Yeah, I think that's one of the main mistakes Americans make when discussing China. I think they've even done polling on this. A lot of Americans assume that most Chinese are as rich as most Americans, or maybe even richer because of the.
Really?
But of course, most Chinese are still quite poor, but at the same time, there might be a middle class in China the size of the United States, but China's got 1.3 billion people. And so that means there's still 1 billion people who are not anywhere near that standard of living. So I think that's a very important point that Americans need to remember when discussing China, is that people talk about China being the second largest economy in the world, but that's not per person by any stretch of the imagination. So.
I told you a story, Ling. I have some Chinese in the family. My brother married a Chinese immigrant. And they went to her home in a rural region. And at that time, at least, there were some parts of China where Westerners were seldom seen. So what is the experience across the country of Chinese engagement with the outside world? Am I making myself clear
Yeah,
there?
so my wife is also
Anyway.
from a rural, she was born, her hometown is what they call Laojia. Is in Guizhou province, in a poor county in Guizhou province.
Okay.
And the first time I went back to see her ancestral home and see her grandparents and these sort of people, the local children were asking me for my autograph because
Okay.
they'd never seen a Caucasian person before.
Okay.
And that was only maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So this has changed in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, Guangzhou. Those areas certainly have changed their perception of foreigners. It's much more regular to see foreigners and interact with them. But in the poorer provinces, it's still quite novel.
Okay. You were telling me that every time you go back, it's like a different world. So tell us something about the pace of change you see in this country.
And of course, I mean, like every time I always visit Beijing and Shanghai, even with Beijing and Shanghai, I mean, like you go to a place in Beijing and you're very familiar with that area. The next time you went there, you go there and you're like, well, what just happened? I'm so lost. There's like another 10 new buildings just sitting there. So, I mean, it's you know, its economy just developed rapidly, increased rapidly in most of the major cities in China. So.
Okay, good, okay. So let me see where we want to go next here. Let's talk about the investments the two countries are making in one another. Is anybody prepared to share something with that? Maybe we're relying on Andy too much here.
Well,
Okay.
he's the expert on that.
So
Right.
tell us a little bit briefly, and then we'll get back to these folks as well on other questions.
Coming back to your point on sort of trade and how
Okay.
things have gone and the investments that we're making. So one important thing to remember that American investments in China they're going there for different reasons. So if we have an investment that's an American firm who's investing in China for just to get cheaper labor, that usually has a negative impact on American jobs, and it's usually overall a negative impact on the economy, right? But if we're going over there for market-seeking purposes or for natural resource seeking, all these sort of things, then it's generally a positive relationship with the home country and the host country for that FDI. So in the past, we saw a lot of American companies going to China to get cheaper labor. We don't see that as much anymore. We're seeing that very seldom, in fact. And now we're seeing companies go to China for market-seeking opportunities, so to sell their products to China, which is very positive.
So the various trade deals that have been proposed around the world to try to assure fair trade, by which we mean comparable standards for the treatment of labor, for the protection of the natural environment, for the protection of intellectual property, and so on. So here's another story to see, maybe provoke some response. I have a colleague who just completed a kind of tour of duty for an American company in China and has returned home with some health problems because of the pollution in Shanghai, and who was as well dismayed by what she saw as a lack of respect for intellectual property of her company among their business partners in China. Can you comment on those kind of the living standard? And then as well, Americans see sometimes pictures of people coming in from the countryside, living and working under very difficult conditions, working very long hours, living in very crowded dormitories and so on, and they wonder if this is, again, fair trade. So you can comment on the living conditions, the working conditions, what you've seen of these. Do you have some experience there?
Well, I'll just bring a historical perspective to it, which is I think that it has been historically part of the industrialization process that countries go through that.
Right.
My hometown is St. Louis, Missouri, and there's very famous photos of St. Louis in the 1920s where it's 12 noon and it's pitch black outside because of the pollution. And as, of course, the United States got wealthier, the environment became a more important priority, and they cleaned up the air. I was talking to some other former students who had lived in Japan, and they were talking about living in a part of Japan that a company had dumped mercury in the water, and it caused all of these birth defects. Then this was like in the 1960s and 1970s in Japan, and that incident spurred the Japanese to make the environment more of a priority. And I think what you see in China is that they're trying to balance the question of environmental protection with getting people out of dire poverty. And a lot of the times they make at least for now, they make the decision to harm the environment, and then we'll decide once we're wealthier, we can clean up the environment. And whether that's right or wrong is certainly a debatable point, but it's certainly not unprecedented. All of the countries that have successfully industrialized go through that process where they usually put development first until there's some sort of environmental catastrophe that pushes them to make the environment more of a priority. So I don't think China's particularly unusual in facing these issues.
The interesting thing, though, is that China's at the tipping point where the eastern provinces and the East Coast is actually shifting away from that. So if you look at the industrial policies of places like Guangdong, and especially the city of Dongguan, which is about an hour and a half from Hong Kong, to put it in perspective, in southern China, they've actually kicked out a lot of their dirty industries and said you either need to go abroad and find someplace else, or you need to go inland where they'll still accept it, these dirty industries, because it hasn't reached that level yet of economic development. So there's actually a big push in Dongguan specifically to automate a lot of their processes, and the government's giving big grants, like $1 million grants, to these companies to automate, use less labor, and clean up the environment. So you're seeing a big transition right now in China, and there are big incentives for these companies to engage. So we're at that inflection point right now in the eastern provinces of China.
So Ling, you talked to me about entertaining visitors from China here in Iowa, and how some of them are surprised, aghast, dismayed. They see American highways with potholes. They see Americans driving very old, rusty cars, and they're surprised by this. My brother was surprised when he went to China to see some very expensive automobiles driven under conditions where, if his response was, if I owned a car, I would not be putting it at that kind of risk, right? People were parking in these very tiny spots and driving on chaotic highways and so on. Can you comment on what your Chinese friends are seeing when they come to the United States? Again, the contrast in expectations and reality there.
Sure. Like I said, I've been here for over 10 years, so I'm kind of used to it. But whenever we have the Chinese guests, they are always impressed by how blue the sky is, and how clear the air is, and they for sure were not impressed by the condition or the quality of our highway or the road or the transportation kind of system. And I just had a visitor from China, and I took her to Chicago, and a lot of my American friends said, well, just get her on the subway and do that. I'm like, I know parking is a pain in Chicago, but I would just take my chance. I would take her with my vehicle, because I'm almost a little bit embarrassed for her to see the subway system in Chicago, which is not as bad as in other cities, to be honest, in America. But but she's from Beijing, and over there the subway. I mean, you guys have been to Beijing, so you just really can't compare. So whenever I have the guests, they always just kind of like surprised and said, whoa, what we see on TV is always like, oh, America being, this top country and have all this, quote them, wonderful stuff. But not, everything we see on TV is true, especially when they see the road condition.
So we're nearing the end of our half hour. And maybe in our concluding remarks, does anybody want to venture any predictions or prescriptions for the future? What would you say there, David? If you,
I would just say I think people should probably just expect things to more or less continue as they are. That I think, like I said, throughout the history of U.S.-Asia relations, Americans run trade deficits with Asian countries. It was true 200 years ago. It's true 100 years ago. And it's probably going to be true whoever is elected president of the United States. And I just would say that it's so much of it is comparing apples and oranges, and that we are a consumer society. We like to consume. We have the money to consume. Our government allows us to consume in ways that other countries do not. And so no particular tweaking of a trade deal is going to change those sort of basic facts on the ground.
So we make you advisor to the president. What are you going to say?
Well, I can, but actually President Xi Jinping, the president of China, he did indicate for the next 5 years, he said we should expect the Chinese GDP increased no less than 6.7%.
We've got just less than a minute here, so we'll give you the last word here, Andy.
Sure, thanks. I think that it would be prudent to look at China as a strategic ally for trade, but also to be cautious about the future. So China's corporate debt is about 160% of GDP, and that's scary.
Okay. So thank you for joining us. I hope we've all learned something about China. We have in our community some experts, and we'll continue to learn more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.